Okay, welcome everyone. We are embarking on a mammoth journey to analyze the book called Tragedy and Hope from Carroll Quigley. It is the best history book I've ever read, and this gave the motivation for the series. Let us begin with a small introduction of the author. So, the author is Carroll Quigley, and he did study in Harvard. Eventually, he became a professor in Georgetown University. Famously, he did tutor Bill Clinton. But I want to deviate from this idea of introduction and credentials because the real gist of the book comes from the critical analysis of historical events. So I believe the worth of the book will appear as we go onwards. The book itself. This book is a brick. It is 1300 pages. It is A4. It is very densely and compact. It's nearly bullet point style. But the caveat is that it has probably the best critical thinking I have ever read in a book. And the style of analysis is multifaceted, meaning the same event can be seen from different viewpoints depending on the people involved. What are we talking about then? What is this book about? So essentially it's the world history from roughly 1870s to nearly 1960s. The book itself got published in 1966. So it is a little bit old, it's 60 years old. This has some benefits and negatives. The negatives is that it doesn't have the retrospective analysis of modern events, while the benefits is that there are some things that could only be understood from the viewpoint of living them. So the change of mentality during the world wars, the change of mentality of Asia, you cannot just see this in retrospective, you have to live to understand it. And this is what the book really does good. And the other thing about history is that so many things are contrary to the popular narration and the way we think events happen, that just stating the facts is enough of a shocking factor. We don't need much of analysis, we just need the correct facts. And the other good thing is that these facts can be cross-checked. So you can just open Wikipedia, say, okay, did this really happen? It did. And the other thing is that I will also be an observer during this presentation. So I will be critically thinking of the book. And if we want to double check something, we will do it together. Okay, so the book starts with a little bit of cliché questions. So it starts by asking, can our way of life continue? Where are we going? Actually, these questions are probably more relevant today than they were back then. But this book was indeed written after two world wars, and such a mentality shift, an actual shift in the world, like country boundaries, ideas, and everything, that the world of like early 20th century and mid 20th century might as well have been a different planet. So, okay, of course, the book will not answer these questions, but it is an excuse to ask a bigger question. Okay, when we ask, where are we going? When we ask, can our way of life continue? What are we talking about? And we're actually talking about the civilization. So, civilization is very hard to define. Many historians have tried to do so. It's very elusive, actually. And there are not many satisfying definitions. But this is Carroll Quigley's book, and we'll go with his definition. It's actually among the most concrete I have read. And the idea of a civilization for Carroll Quigley is that the minimal self-sustained social unit. So let's give an example. So let's have Canada, right? So Canada is a country. Is Canada a civilization? Probably not, right? Canada cannot be self-defined. Why cannot Canada be self-defined? Because there are many social relations from Canada that are not within Canada. So from Canada to the US, from Canada to Europe, from Canada to Australia. So when we talk about the civilization, it has to be self-sustained, right? So we want the minimal social unit that the majority of connections are within the social unit. So, for example, when we talk about the classical civilization, Roman Empire, um, and the equivalent of Chinese civilization during the period, they had connections, but they weren't really connected that much. So then that makes them distinct civilizations. For example, the USSR was a different entity than the Western civilization, but France is not that different from UK in terms of civilizations. With this in mind, then, do civilizations really exist? And if so, have they died? Did they exist and they stop existing? What happened to them? So can we say that Greece, for example, was part of different civilizations during the classical period and later with Byzantine period? Same. Was really the Cynic civilization up to the Han Empire, different than the later Manchu Chinese civilization, right? The idea is yes. So we have seen major civilizations from ancient history, from Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, Minoan civilization, that they did exist, they did expand for some period, and then they collapsed. Right? Rome is a very easy example. The Roman Empire at its peak was probably like the largest empire in the world, and then a few hundred years later, it completely disappeared. So, what we will try to do is now see these civilizations and try to give a life cycle to them. This will be a model. A model has to work in abstract, and in particular in the first level of abstraction. It doesn't have to work exactly per se, it just needs to give some guidance, some good idea of what's going to happen, right? So let's give an example. So if I want to go vacation in Australia, I need a lot of money. Let's say maybe I need 5,000 euros. If I want to go vacation in a cheaper country, let's say in Thailand, I still need money. I don't need as much money. So in this case, if we had a model to compare the cost between Australia and Thailand, we're fine that saying Thailand is cheaper, essentially. Finally, we do arrive at Quigley's model of civilization life cycle, and it goes as follows. So in the beginning, there is a mixture period. So there has to be some pre-existing elements of different civilization where they combine to create something new. For example, the classical civilization got born out of the Minoan civilization, the Phoenician civilization, Mesopotamian ideas, Egyptian ideas. Later on, the Western civilization itself came out of classical civilization along with the Jewish religion, ideas from Germanic tribes. All of this came together to create a new thing. So after this starts to happen, there is a gestation period where these ideas become solidified, become something new, and an instrument of expansion is born. This is really important because to talk about the civilization, we need eventually to expand. We cannot just stay static in one place. So we need expansion in culture, expansion in economic expansion, like the things we make, and population expansion, and also boundary expansion. So we need to expand geographically, we need to expand population wise, and culturally and idea wise. Um, Maybe technology can come here as well, like expansion in technology. It's not really necessary though. Okay, so we do have expansion, but eventually this expansion stops, right? And when it stops unequally during the empire of the civilization, and this creates conflict. So we enter an age of conflict. This is where we see class struggles, this is where we see imperial wars just to get extra resources for our population for no other reason. Um, and eventually, by all of this mess up, we have a universal empire where, because of the political units get reduced straight up by conflict, some of them get conquered, some of them stop existing. Eventually, there will be somebody that will conquer the entire thing. So, this is what the universal empire is. This is where things stay a little bit static. Think of like Pax Romana, think of like Golden Age of Greece, or Pax Americana recently, right? and eventually went a decay station, and then the civilization get invaded and conquered. So what is really important here is that uh, for a civilization to be conquered, it has to give up by itself. It has to come from in the decay states. So think about it. Greece conquered Egypt with Alexander the Great really easily. Same with Mesopotamia, right? With when Persia had the Universal Empire. But America never really conquered USSR because USSR wasn't in a state of decay. The Western civilization couldn't conquer the Eastern civilization, right? Um, Let us now look this idea of expansion further. So, as we saw, in order for a civilization to exist, it needs to expand. That means in terms of culture, knowledge, population, and geography. Otherwise, just purely by definition, it would remain static and either achieve nothing or eventually get conquered. So, just by this idea of expansion, we're adding new areas into the civilization. There is this core and periphery distinction. So, core is where the things began, is where the culture is the strongest, and there is outlook of life is more tied to the culture, where the periphery is the areas newly added, usually not that tied to the culture, and tend to be more materialistic, tend to care more about this idea of expansion, of getting rich, getting more powerful, rather than the reasons we do this, which is what we would call as culture. So there is this distinction between the core and the periphery. So, for example, the West started in England, France, and Italy, but America or Australia, Canada would be considered as like periphery. Um, in classical civilization, Greece would be the core of things, but eventually Rome became really powerful and rich, and that's the idea. There is no better way to explain it with a few maps. So let's take the idea of Mesopotamia. It started within the Tigris and Euphrates, and eventually Babylon became really powerful, which was in periphery, and then Assyria and then Persia came and conquered everything. Uh, the Minoan civilization, with its core in Crete, also um, conquered a lot of the Greek coast and Greek islands, but eventually the Greek coast also became richer and more powerful. The classical civilization started in Greece and then eventually adding the entire of Europe and a lot of Asia Minor and the northern coast of Africa. The Western civilization, we can roughly say it started in England, France, north of Italy. Eventually, Central Europe joined in, then America, then Australia, and then the colonies. After the age of expansion comes the age of conflict. So, the instrument of expansion itself can be useful up to a point. There will be a point where just by its definition will not be able to help things grow faster. The instrument of expansion itself can vary depending on the civilization. For example, Phoenicians used trade, but they could trade, for example, in Mediterranean. It could only go so much. Classical civilization had slavery, albeit slavery in ancient Greece and Rome was very different than modern ideas of slavery. Slaves had actually better jobs, better life, and their master were actually responsible for their well-being. But there can only be so many slaves. Even I believe Athens, Rome, Sparta had like slave populations from 40 to 80%, if I'm not mistaken. Um, feudalism in Western Europe, the first instrument of expansion, could only grow so much. So when this starts decline, the rate of expansion declines, that's when we see class struggles, imperialist wars, and all this causes trouble in the society. We could say rationality, pessimism. Essentially, things start to collapse. The way of life cannot continue as it is. And this essentially is what we call conflict. So then the vested interests in the society have to clash in some wars, some revolutions, or something, and then somebody eventually has to come out on top. So, what is the outcome of this? The answer is we don't really care. So, the civilization itself won't stop existing just because there is conflict. So, what will happen is that there will be some reorganization. And there are two outcomes of this. Can we discover a new instrument of expansion? And this only has actually happened in the Western civilization, where we went from feudalism to commercial capitalism into industrial capitalism. So we had three different instruments of expansion. That's why it's the most powerful civilization and also the longest, among the longest living. But if we cannot, we enter this thing called universal empire, where some group gains enough power, there is a reduction in other political groups and conquers everybody. So in the beginning, classical civilization had Greece and Rome. Eventually, Rome conquered Greece and made an empire. Let's see some more examples. But the idea here is that usually the victor of the class struggles is in the periphery. That's an aside, but it is interesting because the periphery has less vested interests, and it is also more materialistic, so it can use more effectively the resources and the instrument of expansion. So, for example, in Mesopotamia, Babylonia was the first conqueror, and then Assyria came, which was more in periphery, and then eventually everything got conquered by Persia, which was way, way more in periphery. Classical civilization started in Greece, then Macedonia conquers everything, then Rome conquers everything. In the Western civilization, we had the biggest players with France and England, and then US becomes the superpower eventually. Even in the Eastern European civilization, eventually we had Byzantine Empire, but then USSR became like the powerhouse of the area. So what we want to end up with is that this idea that there are civilizations, they do have life cycles, and what we're interested in is to see the what happened with the Western civilization. So many, just because of how powerful it is and how fast it can spread its ideas with advances in transportation and communication, it conquered many other civilizations really fast, all at the same time. For example, the Japanese civilization collapsed, the Chinese civilization collapsed, the Islamic civilization collapsed with when Ottoman Empire stopped being a nation. And this all happened at the same time, and it starts giving a hint of the conflicts of the 20th century, why there was like so much pain and so much tragedy in the world during that period of time. And eventually, this we will see in more detail when we come to history and stop analyzing civilization theories. But before that, let's see actually the Western civilization in a microscope. But before we go there, let's give a recommendation. That's a book recommendation. It's Quigley's other book, The Evolution of Civilization, and it's a full 500-page book analyzing just the ideas we discussed the last 20 minutes, just by example and going through every major civilization, just one by one. We arrive at the West, and roughly we already said that the West began, let's say, in England, France, north of Italy, and everything started after the Roman Empire fell. So let's give a starting point of 350 AC. So, what's really important about the West? It is the Dark Ages. So, during the classical civilization, this idea had developed that the state is total. The state has to control social life. The duty of the citizen is towards the state. And by extension, the state is no different than religion, and the state is no different from economy. That's at least the outlook of ancient Greeks, ancient Athenians. That's what we read in philosophy. That's what we read in whatever historical statements we have from them. And it really needed Dark Ages to make people see that, okay, society can exist without the state. So society and state are distinct things. And eventually this culminated into this Western idea that the judiciary, the government, and religion are all different entities. And there is also this rule of law. These entities have to serve society, and not society has to serve the state. That's really unique to the Western civilization. It comes also from ideas of Christianity, but that's actually the origin of these things. So, in terms of other aspects of culture, there was a mixture between the Romans, the Jewish, especially Christianity, and Arab aspects, and we have the core that is in England, France, and Italy. In particular, we have some early innovations that directly come after the Roman Empire. So we have a move from infantry to mountain defense, essentially the knight. There is collapse of slavery, and instead we're using animals to do the work in the fields, and we're also using a better agricultural system, which was actually inefficient in the classical civilization and was just maintained from tradition. So in classical civilization, we had the two-field system. So the nutrients in the soil are depleted. So the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans were using half the field one year, half the field the other year, and they were swapping them, and the intermediate was to refresh the nutrients. After that, we have the Germanic tradition of the three field, so we split it into thirds. And as we said, from the Dark Ages comes this idea of decentralized power into local communities. So the first instrument of expansion was feudalism. So what is the idea of feudalism? So just because now we have the knight, and the knight needs training, it needs resources, and it's also very effective for protection, but this knight has to be sustained. So we have a large number of farmers sustaining essentially a small number of knights. And it's also probably the only period in history where there was a stalemate in attacking and defending, because we had the castle, but the knight couldn't conquer the castle unless there was an extended siege. And also the castle itself couldn't conquer the knight. So there wasn't any attack or any real defense happening, just defending from invasions. So that's why things stayed decentralized. So we had the landlords, which essentially ruled the society along with the knights, and things would stay stale, but we have this demand for luxury goods. And this was the first time where we had a reason to create towns and create specialized occupations, essentially coming from demand for luxury goods. But this lasted until, let's say, around 270, and then we have the first hints of the first age of conflict. So we have the Hundred Years' War, we have things like the Black Death, and in general, big social unrest in Europe. And now we arrived at the unique thing about the Western civilization, that what would happen as a universal empire when England was starting conquering France, for example, got circumvented. So this universal empire never happened, and this circumvention came from a new instrument of expansion, this time commercial capitalism. And the idea is here is that we still have demand for luxury goods, so let's just use ships to bring them, and we get rich and expand like that. So this essentially led to early colonialism. This led to the early conquering of India, etc. And eventually we have the second age of conflict, uh, funnily called Second Hundred Years' War, unofficially. In reality, it was a period from 1680 to around the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where many things happened. So we have the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars, all happening this roughly 130-year period. So it's fair to say this was an age of conflict. Well, so the year is 1812, Napoleon controls most of Europe, at least the important parts. But does that mean he won anything? Can he really keep it? The answer is no. And this was from the beginning. So what had happened was England could oppose this and could always win because industrial revolution happened in England. And we entered the third instrument of expansion, which is industrial capitalism. This is the industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution, actually, which is less known. Um, and this was the second circumvention of a universal empire in the Western civilization. So we will now do a sneak peek on the first hint of the economic theories of Carroll Quigley. They are actually top notch and they will be a major focus of our next chapters. And we'll see the evolution of capitalism. What was capitalism? How it got into industrial capitalism? What happened afterwards? And where are we now? Actually, things haven't changed much since the Second World War, at least in the direction of capitalism. Okay, so in the beginning, we have this thing we call commercial capitalism. Essentially, we were funding trips abroad with ships to carry goods, and the money, the value was being generated just based on arbitrage, essentially. So this got changed when we had industrial capitalism because it could out compete essentially everything else. And the idea with industrial capitalism is that the power is on the owners. So the owners have the factory, the owners have the field and the crops. So the laborers go there work, but both the economic benefits and the power benefits go to the owner. The laborers get something just to survive, but the power goes there. After that, we had what we called financial capitalism, and this evolved from industrial capitalism because we needed big investments. Why we need big investments? Because we had, for the first time, to build railroads. We had to build really, really big projects. So it wasn't enough to have private bankers. It wasn't enough to have family companies or family ownership. We needed share things. So we have the company with the shares, and this is very different from the previous states because what does having a share means? It means that the wealth is being distributed equally. So whoever has a share, he has that proportion of the company, he gets that proportion of the reward and the revenue, or the share increase, the share price increase. But the power is not distributed equally. The big shareholder is on the board of directors while the small shareholder just stays at home. So the big shareholder makes the decisions and he even gets like the stake of the small guy that doesn't do anything. So wealth is being spread equally, power doesn't. Power goes to the big shareholders, which are usually bankers. There was an intermediate stage between the pluralist economy we have today, and that was monopoly capitalism. That arose basically from people being on the board of many different companies so that they could coordinate and control things and eventually create monopolies. Think of Rockefeller or think of JP Morgan. And the idea now is that in the previous states, just because we had big projects, we need big investment. Well, when we have a monopoly, we can control the market. We don't need investment anymore. So the power stops going to bankers and it goes to managers. Because then we control the market, usually they tend to decrease cost, decrease supply, and just raising prices. There were many examples actually, even in England and US, about this. But that's a concern for later. So that was the monopoly capitalism states, and eventually we have the pluralist economy. This only happened after the Second World War, and it happened because the science advanced so rapidly, so quickly, and also this idea to apply scientific knowledge into business, into planning, uh, came in. But we have this problem here. So the owner has stock in the company, can fund the company, but cannot operate the company because we need the college educated expert to come and control the company for the owner. So the decision power, the power of the company, goes to the externally hired CEO, the externally hired expert, while the ownership to the company stays with the guy that has the stocks, the guy that funded the project. And for the first time, we have this division. We have a managerial class that basically makes decisions and runs the company, and the ownership is usually separated from them. So, actually, just a historical aside, this idea of managerial revolution, let's call it, started from James Burnham with the book Managerial Revolution. And it's actually the book that inspired 1984 from George Orwell. And also, there is this second book, um, Leviathan and Its Enemies, that came later and essentially expanding on this idea. If you ask me, this is the best way to explain the current pluralist welfare state type of economy, and it gives many insights. So because now we have like this managerial class that doesn't have stake in the company and can only look to benefit itself, and how do managers get benefits? Essentially by having problems and never solving them. And some examples can be seen on climate crisis, where we have all these protests, all this, but we never really do take action, or if we take action, it's really slow. But that's on an aside, and we will analyze it later in later chapters as well. Okay, let's see everything in perspective then. So we have the mixture period, roughly, let's say, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the end of the Dark Ages. Then we have the gestation period until the fully fledged feudalism. Then feudalism was the first instrument of expansion, which evolved into commercial capitalism, which evolved into industrial capitalism. And we have the conflict periods with the Hundred Years' War, the Second Hundred Years' War, and let's say World War II, where the core empire would be Germany at the extent of them conquering Europe. So if this theory we have analyzed so far holds true, then there is two possible futures. Either we will have a fourth instrument of expansion, some form of expansion to circumvent the universal empire, or a universal empire for the Western civilization will come from the United States. And if we do have a universal empire, we pretty much seal our fate and we'll have some form of golden age, Pax Americana or what have you, and eventually on to decay and invasion from some other civilization. But let's stop with the theories and start saying more concrete things. And that's this idea of Western civilization. We had some advances that cannot be refuted. For example, Industrial Revolution. And what we saw is that these ideas spread around the world, right? So in the beginning it was only in the UK, and then eventually it came to Europe, came to the US, came to Asia. But because there was many significant advances in different fields, as we will see, and they didn't happen at the same time, this caused issues. And many of them, the world right now, and whether a place has democracy, a place is authoritarian, can be partially explained by the way these ideas spread. And that's what we'll see now. So, as we said, we have diffusion of ideas, diffusion of materials, and diffusion of culture. Let's define it more. What can be diffused and how fast it gets diffused. So, we can pretty much divide a civilization, the products of the civilization, into culture. Culture is customs, life outlook, religion, etc. And these are things that are very hard to spread. It can even be impossible. So, for example, for the West, we can define that it's it's positive. So we expect that tomorrow is better than today. This comes essentially from Christianity. It's the only religion that looks at the future as a positive thing. Compare this to any other religion before that that said, okay, we have a book, everything is written there, all the important things happen in the past, and that's it. So, for example, like the ancient Greeks were looking at Homer as like the greatest achievements. They were looking at the ancient myths, the Greek myths, with that was like the golden age of Greece. It was in the past, but not in the future. While Christianity has these repeated elements, like Jesus comes every Easter and saves humanity, there will be the second coming, that everybody will be salvated and everything. And this give a positive outlook. Also, Christianity is unsolved, so we don't have everything in the Bible is up to interpretation. Actually, to find God, we have to go out in nature and find the God in nature. So nothing is set in stone. There was multiple revisions in the Bible itself. We have, I believe, the first one in Ikea, where all the religious people gathered and decided what's important, what's not important, and this got edited later. So these are part of the culture and the outlook. Scientific outlook is also integral to the Western civilization. Pretty much, if something holds, it has to be testable, it has to be rational, it cannot come from a god like making the sky rain. Rain comes from water evaporating, and that's part of like the culture. And this is very slow or impossible, as we said before. Then there is the material things. Okay, we produce a car in UK and we can put it on a ship and then ship it all the way to China in a single like month. So this can spread fast. And this essentially is the root cause of all the trouble we will try to explain. That material spread, culture is impossible or very slow to spread. And the way they spread is actually really messed up. But let's see it. So, what did the Western civilization then create so it can diffuse it? What was made? What was unique so we can spread it around? And we can distinguish four categories. So, we have ability to kill, essentially make good weapons. So, China made gunpowder even before Europe, but Europe made guns, right? Europe made big boats, Europe made tanks. Western civilization make the atomic bomb. So we made very advanced weapons, missiles, what have you. So we have things that are related with medicine. So we made sanitation and spread the sanitation. We made antibiotics after the 19th century. We made vaccines, which was really important. And this was stuff that was extending life and more importantly dropped the mortality, the infant mortality. So historically, we had roughly 50% infant mortality in humans. But what we saw, and actually in many statistics that show the mean age, the mean lifespan increasing, essentially we're reducing infant mortality, and this increases the average lifespan as well. So we have ability to produce, and we do know industrial revolution, but actually the more important thing that we'll discuss soon is the agricultural revolution. So the ability to produce food. This was pretty much the basis of everything. We need more food so we can have more people to do more things and do more stuff and do more work. And finally, came last was the ability to reduce distances. This was the canals in the UK and eventually the railroads, eventually the telegram, eventually the phone. Things that reduce distance between information and between actually like transporting stuff. But let's focus on this industrial revolution that came first, essentially, and was the most important. So we do actually start with the agricultural revolution, and agricultural revolution in UK started like roughly 50 years before industrial revolution. So we would say that agricultural revolution happened around 1770, 1725, with industrial revolution roughly 1755. And what happened there? So we had the three field system of the Germanic people, but we discovered leguminous crops. And the most important thing in the soil that makes plants grow is nitrogen. Leguminous crops help capture nitrogen from the air and induce it into the soil. And they can also be used as food for cattle. So just by introducing leguminous crops, we essentially refresh the soil faster, and we can also use the crops themselves for cattle, for meat. And this increased both the quality and the quantity of food. Okay, by how much? Well, let's take a look. Isn't this an increase and a half? So we just said that agriculture revolution started around 1725, so nearly the beginning of this graph. And what we see in roughly 300 years, the population of Earth grew 10 times. So we were, for the entire history of Homo sapiens, which is 200,000 years, we stayed below 1 billion. And then in 300 years, we added another 8 billions into the population. And it all started just by essentially discovering leguminous crops in UK, roughly in the beginning of the 18th century. Well, why is population important in analyzing things? Is because roughly societies can be partitioned into four categories depending on the birth rate and the death rate. So what we see in nature is that we have high birth rate and high death rate. So mothers with many kids, and many of them die as infants, early human deaths for whatever reasons, and that's with high birth rate, high death rate, and numbers roughly stable. Eventually, we migrate into some second category where the death rate drops with the introduction of medicine and sanitation, but the birth rate is still high. Like there is still this lag that people didn't get the point, they're still producing many kids. So then we have numbers in the society rising. And the majority of the population at this time is in their prime. They are a working population. Eventually, what we saw empirically, at least in Europe, is that birth rate also starts falling at some point onwards, especially when we have a high urbanized population. And it's also what we see today, right? People don't make many kids, and we don't have that many deaths. So we have small births, small deaths, and then the numbers are also roughly stable. But just by pure logic, eventually we'll have people will grow older and they will start dying out, right? So the number will start decreasing because the birth rate is still low, but the death rate starts rising because the majority of the population is very old. And that's when essentially numbers start falling, and it's essentially the demographic outlook of Europe and the Western world at this point. But just by distinguishing in part, which of these parts a society is, we can see if there is a rise in population, and if there is a rise in population, there is higher demand for resources, higher demand for space, for like the society has to increase. There is a population pressure coming from that society, and that has to go somewhere. So there will be wars, there will be migrations, and this is what we'll see in the next slide. Okay, so when troubles start happening, they start happening when we essentially transition from population B to population C. So because agricultural revolution started in the UK and in the Western Europe and then spread outwards, this didn't happen at the same point, the same time for everybody. So it began with UK and France, as we said, around 1850. We had like this transition from B to C, and that's when we have to send this population somewhere. So we, at least in the beginning, they sent them to colony. That's why colonialism was so prominent. So this extra population, we send them to colonies. We send them to Australia. We send them to Africa. We send them to America, or whatever. And that was the first problem. Okay, then things came to Central Europe, and there was this population pressure around in the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, what did we have? Two world wars, right? There was a population pressure from there. They couldn't go anywhere, so they made war. Okay, next stage. So eventually, agricultural revolution reached Eastern Europe, Russia. When was the transition from this population from B to C? It happened after 1950. Well, what did we have? USSR. We had the Soviet Union. So that was the population pressure. And in our lifetime, we have like this transition in Asia, right? From B to C. And we do see even today some pressure from the Asian countries like China. Again, into perspective, around 1850 we have the Anglo-French pressure, essentially translated into colonialism, then the German-Italian pressure into world wars, then the Soviet pressure in the Cold War, and then now we have the Asian pressure, mostly coming from China. Okay, but we have analyzed population. Let's see the whole messed up thing. So, in terms of order, what happened in the West? So we have Western ideology, that's the basis. Then we make weapons. Then we make agriculture. Then the Industrial Revolution. So, again, ideas, ideas, weapons, ability to conquer things, more people, more stuff, then less deaths and better sanitation and better medicine. Then we increase our numbers, and then we make railroads and telegrams and phones and everything. Okay, so let's take Asia, just because Asia was like the farthest point from the Western civilization, and see what happened. Okay, when Asia met Europeans, they first saw the weapons. So when we went to open Japan, or when we tried to conquer China with the Opium Wars, they saw the weapons, and they could get the weapons most readily. But how did this stuff come to there? So then the transport revolution arrived, and also the sanitation and the medicine arrived. But then the industrial revolution arrived because they wanted more things, and we have a demographic explosion, but not because we have more food, because less people are dying. And then the agricultural revolution comes, and we don't know if ever the ideology will actually come at least the same way as in the West. So this whole mix-up of ordering makes a lot of issues. And some examples. So there is this idea of Carroll Quigley that democracy goes along with the type of weapons in the society. So when the weapons are really advanced and the state controls the weapon, let's say atomic bombs or airplanes or sophisticated weapons, then the state can exert pressure into the population to make them more submissive. So that's when we have more authoritarian governments. When the weapons are cheap and they're diffused into the population, for example, guns, the first handguns or that we saw in American West, or the hoplite in ancient Greece. It was simple weapons. Everybody could be a hoplite. They just need a sword and an armor and some training. That's when democracy rises. So when Asia saw the Western weapons, they were advanced weapons. The population wasn't rich enough to buy them, so the government bought them. And that's also one more reason, along with the pre-established culture, that made spreading democracy there so hard and so slow. So the other idea is that we have medicine coming in first and saving lives, but we don't have new workforce being born because the agricultural revolution came later. So we still need to use this aging population right now to make more stuff and to buy things. But how can we do that? We need to suppressing people, and we saw this in China with the Great Leap Forward, and in Russia with the gulags and the 5-year plans. That in order to get money, to get work, to buy advanced materials and industrial materials, the governments essentially traded human lives for products, right? They decided to oppress the population to the point of starvation to be able to afford industrial products. These are some examples, but we keep the theory up to this point, and everything else we'll discuss at later chapters. Okay, so this is a small revision of what we already said. So what we saw happen is that governments became more authoritarian just because they can control the weapons. Italy became fascist, Germany became Nazist, Soviet Union got communism, China with Mao Zedong, etc. The standards of living collapsed because the governments had to decide, okay, if we want industrial goods, we can either go into debt or oppress our people. And they usually decide to oppress the people. But now we move on to the next section and essentially see the psychology of the West and how it changed after the two world wars. Here we are, and the idea of looking into psychology is that psychology matters in historical analysis in a way it doesn't matter into science in other fields. For example, let's say physics, right? Tomorrow we have John. John is very healthy, he's 20 years old, but he decides he wants to fly, he wants to defy gravity. So he wakes up tomorrow and tries to fly. Well, gravity still exists, so he cannot fly. If he jumps, he will fall into the ground. But, and that's the laws of physics, right? So emotions and mentality cannot control the laws of physics. But what happens with psychology in history? What if we have a society and a society really hates their neighbor? There is all this animosity, all this hatred going on. Well, this makes war all more likely. So, or what if we have a very pacifist society? This makes peace all more likely. So psychology does affect reality and can be helped to predict the future, at least in historical analysis. So here we arrive. This is a really big slide, and essentially it captures the ideas of the mentality of people in the West up to 1900s. So that's the 19th century, what we believed, what we had seen so far, and what was the outlook of life. And it all starts from this idea that the man is innately good. So man is born good and free, and then society is only there to start corrupting the person. It's very clear in Rousseau, for example. And this is the basis of everything. So on top of that, we have the faith in science and the secularism. So we've seen the marvels we can do. We can do flight. We can harness electricity. We can um, make so many things just from the coming from science that we start believing man is godlike and man can control nature, at least in that sense, not in a paranoid sense. And then rationality can explain the universe. Everything in the universe has to have an explanation. And we're also more materialistic because science is materialistic. And without, in a secular society with less reliance on religion, what is evil then? And we also believe that man by itself is good, so evil has to be some distortion. There can be no evil by itself. Evil has to be an outcome of some extreme process. Okay, so all this combined essentially give us liberalism and capitalism. Liberalism is essentially saying that society is bad, so the state and the government should have as little interference in business, in daily life as possible. And capitalism essentially says, okay, it's one step further. It's the idea of community of interests. If we have to really give a very, very small synopsis of capitalism, essentially it says, my short-term good can be translated into long-term good for the society. This worked and didn't work depending on the period and depending on the world situation. We'll analyze it more later. But again, this criticism of capitalism is only in terms of society, in terms of civilization. It's not in terms of the psychology of the person, whether capitalism works or is the best system based on how free people think, how free people feel, and how happy they are. It's just an analysis based on facts and the outcomes on the society. Okay, and finally we have this belief in progress, and so if we are advancing that well and so fast, this will keep on forever. And also nationalism. So, and nationalism can be described as, if we are alike, we should organize politically. And usually this alike part means terms of countries. But this is the outlook up to the First World War. But let's see what happened in the 20th century. That really changed everything. So we have these beliefs up to roughly 1913, just before the First World War. And then what happens? We have World War One, and this trauma, this crazy, what happened here? Like nobody could really believe that the amount of life sacrifice, the amount of economic damage happened in World War One. It was like unprecedented. Nothing like that had ever happened before. Like people saw their countrymen so willingly going to die in the front lines, and could hardly believe it. Like all this despair, all this damage, and this played a very big role into the next problem, which was the World Depression, the stock market collapse in the 1933. And why did that happen is because at the end of the World War One, people couldn't explain what happened, so they decided, okay, let's devote the next 10 years to try to build the world as it was before the First World War. And this failed, and when it failed, it pretty much brought the depression. And then World War II happened with unprecedented amounts of violence, destruction. It was essentially a war fought in every continent, every piece of land, everywhere, even in space, right? With the fight with the missiles and everything, and the atomic bombs. So these three things happen, and let's see the shift in the mentality. Okay, this idea that man is innately good, well, after this experience, man has to be at least capable of being very evil. If he is not very evil by himself, at least he can be very evil. So when we used to believe that society is a corrupting force, well, we saw what can happen. So society maybe uplifts the man. So society is necessary. When we believe that evil is just the absence of good, and evil just doesn't exist by itself, well, with Hitler, with concentration camps, with Stalin, with gulags, well, evil exists and must be resisted and overcome. Well, human abilities, where we used to believe they're innate and should be left alone to flourish, now we believe that there has to be some social planning, some social training. And when we believe in laissez-faire capital liberalism, well, now we need to socially plan and socially discipline the population. And when we believe that there was a community of interests, like my interests can be expressed as the interests of the society in the long run, no, now we have a welfare community. So the state has to decide how the money spreads essentially and where the benefits goes. So this was the outcome and the mentality shift after World War II, and we can really see a schism in the psyche of the man. And this will be pretty much discussion for later aspects of the series. But essentially what we will see is that we have this fear of retrogression, this rise of authoritarianism instead of democracy, and the rise of the welfare state. That's pretty much the outcome of this psychological change. So we did it for now. That's the end of part one. We covered the first 30 pages of the book, and I remind the audience that this book has 1300 pages, so we have a long way to go, but it's a start. A start is a start.